February 7th, 2010. A black SUV slowly pulls into the parking lot of the Ontario Provincial Police Headquarters. The driver steps out wearing polished shoes, a dark jacket, and the quiet confidence of someone who spent an entire career giving orders. Colonel Russell Williams wasn't nervous. He wasn't under arrest. In fact, he had agreed to be there. At that moment, Williams believed he was simply helping detectives with a missing persons investigation. What he didn't know was that the detective waiting inside already had evidence connecting him to one of Canada's most disturbing crimes. Not DNA, not fingerprints, not a witness, something much simpler, a single tire track. Over the next few hours, one of Canada's most respected military officers would watch the life he had spent decades building disappear piece by piece. And the remarkable part wasn't that detectives caught him. It was how they did it. Before we step inside that interrogation room, we need to answer one question. How does a man trusted with millions of dollars in military equipment, a decorated Air Force commander, someone who regularly flew alongside members of the royal family, and he once served as a pilot for Queen Elizabeth II, become one of Canada's most notorious murderers? Because if you had met Russell Williams before 2010, there's a good chance you would have trusted him too. Who was Russell Williams? Russell Williams looked like the last person anyone would suspect. He had spent decades climbing through the ranks of the Canadian Armed Forces. Colleagues described him as disciplined, intelligent, organized. He eventually became commander of CFB Trenton, one of Canada's largest and most important military bases. It was a position that required extraordinary trust. He managed thousands of personnel, oversaw major operations, and represented the Canadian military at the highest levels. To the outside world, Russell Williams had everything: a respected career, a successful marriage, financial stability, social status. Nothing about his public life suggested what investigators would eventually uncover. But public appearances can be remarkably misleading. Behind the polished uniform, behind the carefully managed reputation, Williams had been living an entirely different life. Investigators would later discover that for years he had secretly entered homes across eastern Ontario. Sometimes the homeowners were asleep, sometimes they weren't home at all. He photographed private belongings, he stole personal items, and over time, his crimes became increasingly serious. It was a pattern of escalation that detectives often see in repeat offenders. Each successful offense made the next one easier to justify. But none of that was visible to the people who worked with him every day. His double life remained hidden. Then, in January 2010, 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd disappeared. She was last seen near her home in Odessa, Ontario. Friends became worried when they couldn't reach her. Her family knew something wasn't right. Police launched an extensive search. Officers interviewed neighbors. Volunteers searched nearby roads. Every hour without answers made the situation more urgent. Detectives faced a difficult question. Had Jessica left voluntarily, or had someone taken her? At first, there was very little evidence pointing in any direction. No obvious suspect, no eyewitness who had seen an abduction, no clear explanation. Cases like this can remain unsolved for years, but this one wouldn't. As investigators examined the area around Jessica's home, they documented everything: every footprint, every tire impression, every physical trace that might help reconstruct what had happened. Among those traces, one particular tire impression stood out. At the time, it didn't reveal a name. It didn't identify a suspect. It was simply another piece of evidence. But detectives understood something important. Physical evidence doesn't forget. People do. And if they found the vehicle that made that impression, the investigation could change overnight. Days later, investigators began comparing vehicles that could have traveled through the area. One vehicle immediately caught their attention. It belonged to Colonel Russell Williams. On paper, there was no reason to believe one of Canada's highest-ranking military officers had anything to do with Jessica Lloyd's disappearance, which is exactly why detectives approached him carefully. They didn't accuse him. They didn't arrest him. Instead, they invited him to come in for a conversation. Williams agreed. Confident people usually do. When Russell Williams walked into that interview room, he believed he was in control. He thought detectives wanted information. What he didn't realize was that Detective Jim Smyth had no intention of rushing. He wasn't looking for a dramatic confession. He wasn't trying to intimidate one of Canada's most respected officers. Instead, he was about to do something much more effective. He was going to let the evidence speak first. And the first piece of evidence Williams would see was the one detail he never expected anyone to notice. February 7th, 2010. The interview room wasn't designed to intimidate. No bright spotlight, no one-way mirror dominating the wall, no detective pacing around the table, just two chairs, a desk, a camera recording everything that was about to happen. When Colonel Russell Williams walked in, he looked exactly like the man everyone expected him to be. Calm, professional, respectful. He greeted Detective Sergeant Jim Smyth with a handshake. Then he sat down. If you only watched the first few minutes of this interview, you would never guess where it was headed, because neither man acted like they were about to change history. A conversation, not an interrogation. One of the biggest misconceptions about police interviews comes from movies. People imagine detectives yelling, slamming folders onto the table, demanding confessions. That's not what happened here. Jim Smyth did something much more effective. He started with an ordinary conversation. He asked about Russell's work, his schedule, his routine, the roads he normally drove. Nothing sounded threatening. Nothing sounded unusual. And that's exactly why it worked. Instead of forcing Williams into a defensive mindset, Smyth encouraged him to keep talking. Every answer created another reference point. Every detail could later be compared with physical evidence. The detective wasn't trying to catch Russell in a lie immediately. He was building a timeline, one piece at a time. Russell Williams appeared comfortable. He answered questions without hesitation. His voice stayed steady. He even offered extra information that detectives hadn't asked for. At first glance, that confidence could easily be mistaken for innocence. But experienced investigators know something important. Confidence doesn't prove someone is telling the truth, and nervousness doesn't prove someone is lying. Those reactions can have many explanations, so instead of judging Russell's behavior, Smyth focused on something much more reliable: facts. Could Russell's version of events survive comparison with the evidence? That was the real question. Notice something unusual about this interview. Minutes go by, yet Smyth still hasn't accused Russell of anything. Why? Because once an investigator reveals all of the evidence too early, the conversation changes. A suspect begins adapting, explaining, rebuilding their story around the new information. Smyth wasn't interested in giving Russell that opportunity. He wanted Russell to commit to his version first. Every detail mattered, every location, every time, every answer, not because each answer proved guilt, but because together they created a story that could later be tested against independent evidence. While Russell answered questions inside the interview room, the investigation outside continued moving forward. Crime scene specialists had carefully documented tire impressions found near Jessica Lloyd's home. Investigators had also begun comparing those impressions with vehicles linked to people who could reasonably have traveled through the area. Most comparisons led nowhere, but one vehicle continued drawing attention: Russell Williams's Nissan Pathfinder. Detectives weren't relying on instinct, they were relying on measurable physical evidence. That distinction matters. Good investigations don't depend on guesses. They depend on evidence that can be examined, challenged, and verified. Nearly half an hour into the interview, something subtle changed. Not in Russell, in Jim Smyth. His questions became more specific. Instead of asking broad questions about Russell's daily routine, he started narrowing the timeline: specific roads, specific dates, specific locations. Russell answered each one, still calm, still cooperative, still believing this was simply a conversation. But the detective now knew something Russell didn't. The timeline was beginning to overlap with the physical evidence, and once those two stories met, one of them would have to break. Then, for the first time, Jim Smyth reached toward the folder sitting on the desk. Until this moment, it had barely been touched. Russell watched quietly. He still had no obvious reason to worry. Inside that folder were photographs, reports, measurements, pieces of an investigation that had taken days to assemble. Smyth didn't slide everything across the table, not yet. Instead, he pulled out just one photograph and placed it where Russell could see it. It showed a tire impression. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just dirt, lines in the ground, nothing dramatic. But detectives already knew those lines told a story. And within minutes, Russell Williams would realize they weren't asking questions anymore. They were beginning to present answers. Up to this point, Russell Williams believed he was helping the investigation. Now, for the first time, he understood something had changed, because Detective Jim Smyth was about to ask a question that sounded incredibly simple, a question about tires. But behind that question was weeks of forensic work. And if detectives were right, Russell's carefully constructed public life was only moments away from collapsing. Jim Smyth looked down at the photograph for just a moment before sliding it across the table. It wasn't a crime scene photo filled with obvious clues. There was no weapon, no fingerprints, no shocking image, just a tire impression pressed into the ground. Then Smyth asked a question that sounded almost casual. "Can you tell me what vehicle you drive?" Russell didn't hesitate. "A Nissan Pathfinder." There was nothing unusual about the answer. In fact, it was exactly what detectives expected him to say. For a few seconds, the room fell quiet. Smyth wasn't interested in arguing. He wasn't trying to surprise Russell. He simply wanted one thing: for Russell to confirm the facts in his own words. Because once someone voluntarily commits to a version of events, every piece of evidence that follows becomes much harder to dismiss. It's easy to imagine detectives solving cases through instinct. Reality is usually much less dramatic. Investigators compare details, they test assumptions, they eliminate possibilities. In Jessica Lloyd's case, specialists examined the tire impressions found near her home. The pattern, spacing, and wear characteristics were documented and compared with vehicles connected to the investigation. Over time, one comparison stood out. The tread pattern on Russell Williams's Nissan Pathfinder appeared consistent with the impressions recovered during the investigation. By itself, that wasn't enough to prove a crime. Many vehicles can have similar tires. Detectives knew that, which is exactly why they weren't finished. The tire track wasn't the conclusion. It was the beginning. Russell continued answering calmly. He explained where he had driven. He talked about his schedule. His tone barely changed. At least on the surface, Jim Smyth didn't interrupt, didn't accuse him, didn't suggest he was lying. Instead, he allowed the conversation to continue naturally. Experienced investigators often avoid turning an interview into an argument. Arguments create resistance. Evidence creates decisions. And Smith wanted Russell to reach those decisions himself. Imagine trying to explain away a single coincidence. Most people can. Now imagine explaining away 5 independent coincidences. That's much harder. This interview wasn't built around one dramatic reveal. It was built like a wall, one brick at a time. The tire track was one brick, the travel timeline was another. Vehicle records added another. Every answer Russell gave either supported that wall or created a crack in his own explanation. And Jim Smyth never rushed the process because he didn't need to. The evidence wasn't going anywhere. Many people assume the goal of an interrogation is to force a confession. In reality, confessions are often the final step. The real work happens earlier. Investigators gather physical evidence, verify timelines, interview witnesses, compare independent facts. Only then do they sit down with a suspect. By the time Russell entered that room, detectives weren't hoping to discover whether he was connected. They were testing whether his explanations could survive the evidence they already had. That's a very different kind of conversation. Smith reached into the folder again. This time, he didn't remove another tire photograph. He placed a different image on the table. For the first time during the interview, Russell looked at something detectives had never mentioned before. A footprint, not just any footprint, one recovered during the investigation. Smith didn't immediately explain why it mattered. He simply let Russell look at it. Silence can be powerful, not because silence forces someone to confess, but because it gives them time to understand what the other person may already know. Russell studied the photograph, then looked back at the detective. The conversation was no longer about helping police. It was becoming something else. Until now, Russell still had room to believe this investigation might move on. That possibility was beginning to disappear. The tire evidence had raised questions. The timeline narrowed those questions. Now another piece of physical evidence had entered the room, one that detectives believed could be linked directly to him, and for the first time, the interview no longer felt routine. Not because anyone raised their voice, not because anyone made a dramatic accusation, but because the evidence was beginning to connect, one piece after another, like parts of a puzzle finally locking into place. Russell Williams had walked into the station believing he could answer a few questions and leave. Now he understood something had fundamentally changed. Detective Jim Smyth wasn't asking what happened anymore. He was showing Russell what investigators believed had already happened. Until this point, and the tire track was still just one piece of the puzzle, an important piece, but not enough to tell the entire story. Jim Smyth knew that. So he reached into the folder one more time. This time, he placed another photograph on the table. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't graphic. It looked almost ordinary. A footprint recovered during the investigation. Smith didn't immediately explain why he was showing it. Instead, he allowed Russell a few seconds to study the image. Then he asked a simple question. "Do you remember the boots you're wearing today?" Russell glanced down, then back at the detective. Investigations are rarely built around surprises alone. Long before this interview began, crime scene specialists had documented physical impressions recovered during the investigation. Those impressions could then be compared with known footwear. Detectives weren't asking Russell to identify the print. They were preparing to show why they believed it mattered. Smith quietly explained that investigators had compared the impression recovered during the investigation with the sole pattern of Russell's boots. The room stayed quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, just evidence, one piece after another. Some people watching this interview for the first time wonder why Detective Smith didn't place every photograph on the table immediately. The answer is surprisingly practical. When investigators reveal everything at once, a suspect has time to create one explanation that tries to account for every detail. By introducing evidence gradually, each explanation must stand on its own, and each new fact becomes harder to fit into the previous story. Whether someone is guilty or innocent, consistency becomes easier to evaluate when the conversation develops step by step. That was exactly how Smyth approached this interview. For nearly an hour, Russell had spoken with confidence. He answered questions politely. He appeared composed. Now, the atmosphere was changing, not because anyone had become aggressive, because the conversation had shifted from possibilities to specifics, specific roads, specific dates, specific physical evidence. Detective Smyth wasn't asking Russell to imagine a scenario. He was asking him to account for evidence investigators believed connected to him. One of the most striking aspects of this interview is what Jim Smyth didn't do. He didn't interrupt constantly. He didn't mock Russell. He didn't try to dominate the room. Instead, he remained patient. That patience served an important purpose. Every calm question reinforced the same message. The investigation wasn't built on emotion. It was built on facts investigators believed they could support. For viewers, that restraint can almost feel unsettling. The quieter the detective remained, the more attention shifted toward the evidence itself. Outside that interview room, Russell Williams was known as a decorated military officer. Inside the room, that reputation no longer answered the questions detectives were asking. Investigators weren't evaluating medals or rank or public respect. They were evaluating evidence. This is one reason high-profile investigations often surprise the public. Status can influence expectations, but it doesn't replace forensic work. As the interview continued, the gap between Russell's public identity and the evidence being discussed appeared to grow wider. Smyth paused, not for effect, but to let the conversation settle. Then he spoke again. He explained that investigators had spent days reconstructing movements, comparing evidence, and verifying details before inviting Russell to the station. That statement carried an important implication. This interview wasn't the beginning of the investigation. It was the result of it. Russell now understood something that hadn't been obvious when he first walked through the door. Detectives hadn't invited him there to discover whether he might know something. They had invited him because they believed he could explain the evidence. There was no countdown, no threat, no dramatic confrontation, only a growing realization that each answer would now be considered alongside evidence already collected. For investigators, that is often the most important stage of an interview. Not the moment someone confesses, the moment they recognize the conversation has fundamentally changed. And in this interview, that moment had arrived. The tire track had raised questions. The boot print added another layer. But Detective Jim Smyth still hadn't revealed everything. One final set of evidence remained. Evidence that investigators believed connected multiple parts of the case together. For nearly 2 hours, Russell Williams had remained composed. The conversation had been calm, methodical, professional. Detective Jim Smyth never treated the interview like a battle. He treated it like a reconstruction, one fact, one document, one photograph at a time. By now, the tire evidence had been discussed. The footwear comparison had been introduced. The timeline had been narrowed. Each piece of information reduced the number of explanations that could reasonably fit the evidence. Then, Smyth leaned forward, not aggressively, just enough to make one point absolutely clear. He explained that investigators had not arrived at these conclusions by chance. Every piece of evidence had been gathered independently. Every comparison had been documented. Every step had been verified before Russell ever walked into that room. The message wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. This wasn't a fishing expedition. This was the result of a completed investigation. Until now, most of the interview had focused on where Russell had been, what he had driven, what he remembered. Now the questions changed. Instead of asking what happened, the detective began asking questions that assumed the investigation had already reached its conclusions, not because guilt had been declared, but because investigators believed the evidence now required an explanation. The conversation had crossed an invisible line. Russell was no longer helping detectives understand the case. Detectives were asking Russell to help them understand the evidence against him. One of the most remarkable moments in the interview isn't something anyone says, it's the silence Jim Smyth waits. He doesn't rush to fill the room with more questions. He gives Russell time to think, time to process, time to decide what comes next. In interviews like this, silence can be just as important as questions, not because silence forces someone to confess, but because it removes distractions. The evidence has already been presented. Nothing more needs to be added. The next decision belongs to the person across the table. Detective Smith then introduced another reality. Jessica Lloyd had still not been found. For investigators, that mattered more than anything else. Finding her was no longer simply about proving a case. It was about bringing answers to her family. The detective carefully shifted the focus. The conversation was no longer only about evidence. It was about what happened next. This wasn't presented as a bargain. It wasn't a promise. It was an opportunity to help investigators answer the most important remaining question. Where was Jessica? Every investigation eventually reaches a point where evidence alone can no longer move the story forward. This was that moment. Russell Williams sat quietly. The detective remained calm. Then the direction of the interview changed. Williams began providing information investigators had been searching for, information that could be independently verified. The interview was no longer centered on whether detectives had the right suspect. It had become focused on locating Jessica Lloyd and documenting what had happened. That transition marked one of the defining moments of the entire investigation. More than a decade later, people still watch this interview, not because it contains dramatic confrontations, but because it demonstrates something investigators often emphasize. Strong interviews are rarely built on intimidation. They're built on preparation. The evidence came first. The interview came second. By the time Detective Smith sat across from Russell Williams, the foundation of the case had already been established. The interview wasn't where the investigation began. It was where months of careful work came together. Later, Russell Williams pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including the murders of Jessica Lloyd and Corporal Marie-France Comeau, also more than 80 cases of stolen underwear from girls in women's homes, as well as sexual assaults. His guilty pleas meant there would be no lengthy murder trial. The evidence, his admissions, and the investigation together established the outcome of the case. For many Canadians, the most difficult question was never how detectives identified him. It was how someone with such a respected public reputation had managed to hide a second life for so long. That question still resonates today. When people remember the Russell Williams case, they often remember the confession, but the confession wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the final chapter. The real story began long before the interview, with investigators who documented a tire track, compared a boot print, verified a timeline, and patiently assembled a case one piece at a time. Because in the end, Russell Williams wasn't defeated by a dramatic interrogation. He was confronted by evidence that investigators believed he could no longer explain. And that may be the most important lesson this case has to offer. Not that one question solved everything, but that careful investigation made the right questions possible. Thanks for watching. If you found this case interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more real interrogation breakdowns and criminal investigations. More cases, more evidence, and more untold stories are coming. See you next time.